in a way, in a selfish way, so to speak, to return a profit to me.
Yes.
Now, if I've given my money to them and hope for the next 20 or 30 years that money is going to come back to me, it's an investment. Now, if suddenly that corporation gets a social conscience and starts operating contrary to that notion,
to your interests,
to my interest,
yes.
I may not be getting back my money, and my family would then be out in the cold, and I would be out in the cold.
Well,
so that would be a more of a concrete illustration.
Well, I guess
of how that would work.
I guess I'll have to accept that, but I would just simply add that you know, a lot has been written and thought about social responsibility by corporations. They even have socially responsible investing mutual funds and this sort of thing. But the thing is, that what you want to understand is that the market itself is of social benefit to society. It generates wealth and it serves to lift everybody out of poverty that's in poverty. And so the market mechanisms that are driven by a selfish self-interest are really all that's necessary. You don't have to have any other social responsibility other than to, you know, to be honest with your customers, not lie to them, to be honest with your suppliers, and not sell products that are dangerous, where you conceal the fact that they might be dangerous. Those are all ethical questions too, but basically within that framework, your only responsibility should be to increase your profits.
So, and you're going to increase your profits by getting more of a better product out to a larger number of people at a lower price.
Simply competing in the marketplace.
Competing in the marketplace.
All that's necessary. That's
so
right.
The more quote unquote selfish that you are, the better you will do and the more people you will benefit, because people will buy your product, of course, to benefit themselves.
Yeah, people talk
and their
about
families or their communities.
Well, we'll take the opposite attack. People who are anti-market, they're always talking about corporate greed, right? Greed is a hot button word. It's an emotional word, and you have to define it. Greed is the kind of behavior that you brand for people who have more than you do. Because who is to say how much somebody should have, you see? So that's the problem with greed. It's all relative.
Okay, so that, of course, brings us to the monopoly.
Okay.
That's what people are going to say. They're going to say large corporations have a monopoly, and then they keep raising the price on things that people need, and then people have less.
Okay. Well, when you bring up monopoly, you're talking about a popular fear that people have that one company in the marketplace will be so dominant that they'll eliminate all the competition, become a monopoly, and then they'll be able to increase prices and gouge everybody. Gouge means to charge more than the customers want. Well, the important point about that, Mark, is that that's never happened. You're looking at thousands of years of free market activity, and that's never happened. If you go back to when we started with these antitrust laws and monopolies back with Teddy Roosevelt in 1902 or whenever that was, about right in there, you think of Alcoa, I guess, was the first one, and Standard Oil was in there, and on and on. And in modern days, we have IBM was a target of the monopoly, the antitrust, and then of course Microsoft. None of those companies were monopolies. They had dominant positions, but in every case, the government interference into the marketplace with force, in other words, to take down the monopoly, the so-called monopoly, hurt the customer, but it helped all the weak sister competitors to the dominant player. So that's what's happening in politics. You know, the government does things for two reasons. One is the reason stated, and the other is the real reason. And the reason stated was to help the customers of, like, for example, Standard Oil, the customers who would buy their product. But the real reason was to help the weak sister competitors, and that's what they did.
Well, a lot of these companies, though, gained a large market share through some kind of government manipulation in their favor
Well,
of the
that's
marketplace.
right. Now, you bring up a good point, because the monopolies that really harm people are the ones that the government sanctions.
And creates through
The government
kickbacks,
creates
mono-
monopolies and sanctions monopolies, and those are the ones that have the pricing power because they have the government behind them. You know, if it becomes illegal to compete with you, then you got a big advantage in the marketplace, and
Mhm.
it happens all the time. You know.
Well, that would be.
Shall we list some of the monopolies to give the the listeners some idea of what we're talking about?
Well, there was a recent monopoly that became very famous. Enron. Enron was one of
Well,
5 companies.
Enron was a monopoly, but
Well, Enron was
you're
one of
digressing
5.
a little bit there.
Enron was one of 5 companies that was given the contract to sell energy into the grid
Sure.
in California, and they were hand-picked companies. There were only 5 of them.
Okay.
Enron was one of them. And the Republicans and the Democrats in California agreed, in the legislature, all agreed to make this one of the companies. And there were 5 of them.
Yeah.
So they were a monopoly, because
Well,
you and I, we couldn't start the Dan Fernandez, Mark Selzer
Well,
power company and sell into the
think
grid.
the word there would be that they were 5 companies that were approved to compete in this artificial creation that they called a market.
Okay.
But I think if we get into the California power market, we're going to be totally lost here.
But I'm trying to provide an example
An
of
example.
government interference.
I was
It's
thinking more
not
of
capitalism. It's
the
not the free
monopolies
market.
that you would think of when you talk about the government monopolies, sanctioned monopolies, would be the power companies,
Mm-hmm.
or your cable company,
Mm-hmm.
or any company that would have government. The railroads were at one time
Right.
monopolies. The reason the government justifies for sanctioning these monopolies is that they say, quote, it's inefficient to compete with, say, the power company, because another 2 companies running lines to your house would be prohibitively
Mm-hmm.
expensive. And so they license that company to be a monopoly to serve this area, and then they regulate the prices that company would have. So we have government-controlled monopolies all the time, and yet people are terrified by free market monopolies that might rise up from competition. And what I'm saying is that we don't have to have antitrust laws. I mean, that's a pretty radical thing to say, right? Antitrust laws is an unwarranted interference into the marketplace, application of force into the marketplace by the government with no really economic justification, because there's never been a free market monopoly, and it is an excuse to use force in the marketplace. That was the first point that we wanted to make.
Okay, so what is an antitrust law? What are they supposed to do?
No, what
and
they do is
they do?
Sure, what they say is that if you get 90% of the market, then you're declared a monopoly. Well, obviously that's stretching the definition, because if you got 10% competition, you're still competing. So that's an artificial altogether. And then they make that illegal. So what they basically do is they go in and they take the monopoly apart. That's what they did with Standard Oil. That's what they tried to do with Microsoft. Take the company that's the so-called accused monopoly apart and make the pieces compete with each other. AT&T had that happen to them too.
Okay.
And what I'm saying is that it's not necessary. It's not in the best interest of customers. It's not in the best interest of the nation. It's a flawed policy.
Now we see companies springing up on the internet, also selling phone service. We see cable companies, now that you've strung the cables through your cable TV, so there is eventually something will come along to compete.
Sure. Competition is a vicious thing in the marketplace, and actually a lot of people are afraid of competition, and so they form cartels.
Okay. Now let's explain how competition is beneficial to me, the consumer. I have a bunch of people out there all trying to get a service to me cheaper and better so they can get one up on their competition, maybe even gain a temporary pseudo dominance over an industry, and that's good for me.
Sure.
Because
Well, I think that most people today appreciate the importance of competition. You know, that wasn't always true back in the last century. A lot of people thought that competition was inefficient. We needed everything run like the post office, where you have one monopoly company like the post office that does that function and nobody else can compete with them, and so it's not duplicated.